David Makinster. This is a lecture on justifying deduction. By the time you see this, you'll already have seen the lecture on justifying induction. And let's begin by asking why it is that we have to provide some sort of justification. When we talked about induction, we talked about how Hume had pointed out we really hadn't explored the mechanics up to that point in history of how inductive reasoning works and how crucial inductive reasoning is actually for both everyday life and especially, and he was concerned, science. So we're going back to the topic of deduction. How do we justify our deductive reasoning about the world? Okay? Why do we need to do that? Well, okay, here's a problem. Okay? Supposing you want to justify some proposition, we'll just call it P. It could be anything at all, any kind of claim about the world. You want to justify that. The usual way we would do that is to present some kind of evidence and say, well, look, Q is true, and if Q is true, that implies the truth of P. How do you know that table's there? Well, I can see it. Well, are we done? Not necessarily, right? Someone might very well say, well, have you ever had a hallucination? Have you ever had a lifelike dream? Have you ever been fooled by a magician? Seeing's not necessarily believing. How do you know that what you see is what's really there, okay? I might provide further evidence and say, well, look, this evidence implies the truth of Q, which in turn implies the truth of P. Now, you can see where this is going to go, right? Wait a minute, someone might say, particularly if we're reasoning in a philosophical context, or we're reasoning in a scientific context. Someone might very legitimately, not just being, overly quibbling about it, okay? Someone might very well ask, well, wait a minute, I don't necessarily know that this is true, and I don't necessarily know that the truth of this would imply the truth of this. You've given me further evidence. I need some justification for that, and also some justification for the notion that this implies this. Are we getting closer to proving our original proposition? No, actually, we're getting further away from it. We're getting further away from it because every time we introduce evidence, we have another layer of things we need to prove. If we introduce further evidence, we have yet another layer to prove. Long ago, a friend of mine put it this way. He said, supposing that you had to pay for a cup of coffee with infinitely many pennies. Okay? You go into the diner, you order the bottomless cup of coffee, the waitress gives you a sly, mysterious look and says, you have to pay for that coffee in advance with infinitely many pennies. Okay, and you say, ha, the joke's on you. I've got on my magic jeans with the magic penny pocket. Every time I scoop out pennies and put them on the counter, it's full of pennies still. So you just start heaping those pennies on the counter. And you can go on forever heaping those pennies on the counter. Are you ever going to pay for that cup of coffee? Are you ever going to get that cup of coffee? No, because no matter how many pennies you lay on that counter, it's still a finite number of pennies. Okay? If you have to pay for something in advance with an infinite amount of pennies or an infinite amount of evidence, you can never pay for it. So if to justify our claims about the world, we needed an infinite regress of evidence, we would never be able to justify any claim about the world. What that means is, at some point, we have to be able to say, okay, that's it. We really don't need any more evidence. And that point should not be the point at which we become impatient, but the point at which we arrive at first principles, things which can stand on their own, which do not need to be justified by further evidence. In other words, justifying by inference, we'll call that inferential justification. Inferential justification is fine if you can stop somewhere. Not everything can be justified by inference. You'd go on and on and on. Aristotle complained about that. People who just keep asking, well, how do you know that? Well, how do you know that? Well, how do you know that? Don't understand that at some point you've got to come to first principles. You've all probably encountered usually this happens with a 2-year-old, right? That's the developmental stage. With a 2-year-old just says, why? To everything you say, why? Well, because blah, blah, blah. Why? Well, because blah, blah, blah. Why? That's not the same kind of a thing. The 2-year-old has just learned if I keep iterating that question, why, I get this really interesting behavior from the adult, eventually, turning purple, getting frustrated. That's not the same at all. This is really a serious problem about the nature of evidence and the nature of knowledge. Where can we justify stopping? Okay? We can stop when we get to something that's able to stand on its own. Okay, so with inductive reasoning, we saw that everything gets down to, all inductive reasoning gets down to that principle of the uniformity of nature. And Hume gave us some reasons for believing that we have as much justification as we need to adopt the principle of the uniformity of nature. Okay? So essentially for deduction, we have to do the same thing. We have to get down to something that can stand on its own. Okay? The terms philosophers often use for this is a priori truths. That's the term that Russell uses in his book. Another very popular way of talking about it is necessary truths. Necessary in the sense that we can't proceed without them, indispensable in other words. We can't even conceive of what it would be for them to be false, and indeed we can't do any more reasoning unless we assume these first principles. Okay? A priori, you can see the word prior in a priori, and that prior does not mean prior in time. It doesn't mean prior as cause and effect. It means that it's logically more fundamental. That's the sense of prior. It is prior in the level of how fundamental it is. A priori truths are things that we have to use in order to make all the rest of our experience intelligible. We can't think without them, we can't reason without them, we can't have language without them, we can't live in the world without them. And if we can prove that something is true a priori, that's a much better proof than any experimental proof could be. Okay? Because experimentation is always inductive reasoning, induction is always to probable conclusions, which means it could always be wrong. If something is true a priori, it's necessarily true. Okay? We can't even distinguish between truth and falsehood without it. Russell mentions 4 candidates for that status of a priori truths. He calls it the laws of thought, and these actually come from Aristotle. Like most contemporary philosophers, I think Aristotle was right in this, but he was not right in the sense he thought he was right, and I'll talk about why toward the end of this lecture. Okay? But are these in fact a priori or necessary truths? Identity, non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, and self-implication? Well, Russell argues they are. Let's start with identity, because all of these really are simply corollaries to the principle of identity, which most logicians traditionally would say is the most fundamental principle of deductive reasoning. What is the principle of identity? Anything is identical to itself. Okay, that doesn't seem very revelatory, right? Except that every error in deductive reasoning gets down to inadvertently violating the principle of identity. Okay, how do you violate that? By contradicting yourself, by introducing a third possibility other than true or false, or contemporary philosophers would like to say true, false, or undetermined, which means you don't know yet whether it's true or false. Okay, self-implication, well, remember circular reasoning, right? Anything implies itself. Circular reasoning is a fallacy because it disguises what it's doing. It misleads you when in fact all it's doing is self-implication. The notion that anything implies itself is an absolutely fundamental principle of deductive reasoning. That's not a fallacy. Okay? Doing that and making it look like something else is misleading, and so that is a fallacy. Okay. Non-contradiction, the same thing can't be both true and not true at the same time and in the same sense. Let's say if it's misty out, you say, well, it's kind of raining and it's not raining. Well, what you mean is there's a sense in which it's raining and there's a sense in which it's not raining, depending on how you define rain. If you have a clear definition of what rain is, either that state of affairs exists or it doesn't. Okay? Or you can't determine whether or not it exists. Okay? But the same thing can't both be and not be at the same time and in the same way, in the same sense. Excluded middle, if you can specify a state of affairs, either that state of affairs exists or that state of affairs doesn't exist. There isn't some middle, as Aristotle called it. Well, is this marker on my hand or is it not on my hand? Well, that depends on how you define on. Okay? If by on you mean at least 50% of it is on my hand, then actually no, because it's balancing on one finger here. Now is it on my hand? Well, do you mean on or in? Okay, now all of those are just a matter of, all of that is a semantic dispute, right? It's a matter of we've not yet clarified what it is we're asking. Once we've clarified what the question is, either the statement, the pen is on my hand, is true in a given sense, or it's not true. Okay, there isn't some third possibility. Self-implication, we just talked about. Okay, as I say, all of these basically are corollaries to the principle of identity. Now, in what sense is the principle of identity a necessary truth? Let's do a little thought experiment, right? Let's try it and see. Can we suspend the principle of identity and still talk? Let's talk about this marker. If I suspend the principle of identity, or I try to, the principle that anything is identical to itself, can I talk about this marker? Sure, I can, and I can't. And I both can and can't. And I neither can nor can't, and all of the above, and none of the above. Because this pen is the pen, but it's not the pen, and it both is and isn't the pen. And it neither is nor isn't the pen, and all of the above, and none of the above. And what I'm saying is what I'm saying, but it's not what I'm saying, and it is what I'm saying, and none of the above, and all of the above. And you see what's happening, right? Language is falling apart. Now, don't worry if that didn't make any sense to you. That's the point. Without observing the principle of identity, we can't refer, we can't distinguish, and so we can't have language. Now, is that just some arbitrary artifact of language? Well, no. Every language has to observe that if it's going to distinguish and refer, and we're actually going to be able to use it, even artificial languages. Well, then, is that just some artifact of human psychology? Well, you know, if you put a can of dog food into a bowl and you put it down for your dog, and your dog gets all excited, he doesn't turn around and eat the chair. Well, why shouldn't he? If it's just an artifact of human psychology that things are identical to themselves, then the chair is as much the dog food as the dog food is the dog food. And you see what I'm saying? We have developed a way of engaging the world that reflects something about the way the world is, and that in turn is reflected in our language. And that's the traditional view is, yeah, that's what necessary truth is about. We can't have language without it, we can't really think without it, and we can't live in the world without it. That's about as knocked down a proof for a first principle as you can possibly give. Okay? So, along comes the 20th century. Okay? And we have a few puzzling things as the whole field of logic just absolutely explodes with activity in the 20th century. Kurt Gödel, a German mathematician, published two papers that are very, very influential and pretty much universally accepted by logicians and mathematicians. One was on arithmetic inconsistency, and the other was on arithmetic incompleteness. Now, the two of them together basically prove this. You can't have a perfectly consistent system of arithmetic that is complete, that allows you to do every kind of arithmetic function that you ought to be able to do. The cost of making it complete, on the other hand, is making it inconsistent. Uh-oh. How's that again? Okay. The problem here is that, and if arithmetic is inconsistent or incomplete, then so is logic, because as one of Russell's great efforts was to try to prove that mathematics and logic reduce to the same set of basic principles. Most philosophers would say that's probably not true, but he did demonstrate that indeed what is going to be true for basic logic, is for meta-logic, as they say, logical theory, is also going to be true for meta-mathematics, or foundational theory in mathematics. So, deductive logic, either inconsistent or incomplete. Where does that leave us? Does that mean, okay, we can start contradicting ourselves? Walt Whitman, the poet, famously once said, "I contradict myself. Very well, I contradict myself. I am big enough to contain contradictions." as philosophers have been quick to point out. The problem is he didn't know the difference there between contraries and contradictories. Okay? Something can be both hot and cold at the same time. For instance, a hot fudge sundae. Part of it's hot, part of it's cold. You know, a sphere may be part black and part white. That doesn't mean that the same part can be both black and white at the same time in the same sense. Okay, that's apparently what Whitman meant. I have a variety of characteristics, and some of them are contraries, because I have such a varied personality, such a varied personage. And that doesn't deny the law of non-contradiction. Okay? Contraries are not contradictories. So what do we do with this? Okay? From Eastern thought comes this admonition. The map is not the world. The great 20th century author Borges wrote a short story called The Map Maker. Okay, in The Map Maker, the main character is obviously a map maker. He's continually frustrated that his maps are either incomplete or inaccurate. No map really reveals the way the world really is, so he keeps trying to make them more inclusive, more detailed, more accurate in every respect. He finally comes up with a map of the world that is complete and accurate. And it is the exact size of the world and contains every detail of the world. Okay? The problem, of course, is it is no longer at all useful as a map. A map has to simplify. A map has to leave things out so that it can highlight the stuff that we need to know in order to find our way around. The map, however, is not the world. And of course, Borges was concerned with, as with many of his short stories, he was very concerned with philosophical themes, and he was concerned with the nature of language and the way of how we represent the world to ourselves. The admonition is just this. Remember, you're using a map. When you use language, when you use logic, when you use any theoretical framework, when you use any conceptual framework, you are using a map. The map is not the world. Okay? The fact that it's not on the map doesn't mean that it isn't there. Okay? Not every map is equally good. Yeah, you can draw maps many different ways that include many different kinds of things, but the fact is that you can draw an inaccurate map as well, one that will get you hopelessly lost, one that will not assist you in finding your way from point A to point B. Or you can draw a more helpful, more accessible, and more accurate map, one that does the work it was created to do. And if you do that, well, then your map making is more successful. Okay? And that's what we want. We want our ideas about the world to be a successful attempt to actually help us live in the world. That's what thought's for. That's what language is for. That's what philosophy is for, to give us help in living in the world. But in order for the map to be helpful, we have to recognize that it is not the world. It is a map. Okay? Now, if you believe that, that's why I say, contemporary philosophers might very well say Aristotle's right, but not in the sense he thinks he is. Okay? This is not something absolute about the world. This is something about how we are constrained by rationality to think about the world and to create maps of the world. Wittgenstein suggested something, actually before Gödel published his work, Wittgenstein suggested that you could have contradictions in a system of logic provided that you also had rules saying you can't derive anything from a contradiction. Okay? Now, for about 20 years or so, I worked, one foot in academia and one foot in the information science industry. And very often what happens when people are creating a multifaceted, comprehensive software system to do whatever, you have bugs. Those bugs very often get down to a matter of you've told in your code the computer to do things that are incompatible. The computer will just hang there, because the computer can't execute two contradictory commands at the same time. So what do? Well, sometimes the testing is taking place just days before the product's going to go out the door. So, well, you know what? We could analyze all the code and find that bug and rewrite everything to avoid that bug, but we don't have the time. And that would be way too expensive. And what's more, we don't need to. We can throw in a rule that says when you get to this point, the software, the code doesn't end run around it. Yeah, we know the bug's there, so we just put in some kind of patch that says, end run around this problem. And Wittgenstein essentially suggested, as people were proliferating different approaches to logic, he said it doesn't necessarily have to be contradiction-free. What we need is rules that allow us to not get stymied or shattered by contradictions, to maybe sometimes do an end run around it. The contradiction is a limitation of the system, of any system of logic, to actually map the world to us. But knowing that no map of the world is going to be perfect, sometimes we have to say, well, here are the points where we have to take the imperfection of the map into account. Okay? So, I have a friend who is actually a world-class logician, and for a couple of years we were carpooling. He was always late. By carpooling I meant I was driving him. But he was always late. And I'd pull up in front of his apartment and I'd be sitting there for 20 minutes and I'd finally see him wandering down the middle of the street with a couple of pastries in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. This was on Saturday mornings. One day, I was about 5 minutes late, and wouldn't you know it, that day, he showed up exactly on time. So he thought this was hilarious, that the one day I was a little bit late, he was on time. So he started in, "Oh my God, how can you be late? That is so irresponsible." He's joking, of course. "So immature, how could you possibly do that?" I said, "Well, Charlie, you embrace the notion that contradictions can be allowed in a system of logic. So you've converted me over to your way of thinking. I was both late and not late." He just grumbled a few choice terms under his breath. And we dropped the subject. But okay, there's the rub. If you're going to allow contradictions, if you're going to try to do an end run around these principles, how are you going to map your system of thought, your system of ideas, your system of logic onto the world so that it remains a useful guide to the world? If it's just a parlor game, then it doesn't matter. But if we actually want to take the logic out into the world and apply it to real life problems, it has to work in that respect, which means, even given that every map is going to be limited, we have to be aware of the ways in which it actually is revealing the world to us as well, and why it is useful. Okay? It's not just anything goes. Okay, we're going to move on in the next lecture to questions about the conception of truth that Russell deals with as well, and I'll have a few additional things to add to that as well. And I want you to think about, as you're listening to that lecture, think about how that dovetails with some of the things that we've been talking about in this lecture about justifying deduction. Okay.